Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Politicians of both sides, of both stripes, often argue about controlling government fraud, waste, and abuse. Few realize, however, there actually are 3 state watchdog agencies whose sole purpose is to make sure California government is responsive to its citizens. One of the most influential is the California Legislative Analysts Office, or the LAO. It was established in 1941 to, quote, ascertain facts and make recommendations concerning the state budget with a view to reducing the cost of and securing greater efficiencies, unquote. In short, the LAO is charged with calling it as they see it, or put another way, speaking truth to power. Our guest is the current legislative analyst, Gabriel Petek. He's only the 6th person to hold that position in the last 80 plus years. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me.
So listen, your office is widely considered one of the most influential at the state capitol, but people around the state may not be aware of actually who you are and what you do. So can you describe the work of the Legislative Analyst Office?
Yes, sure. Basically, we are the state legislature's nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisor. As you noted, we were created in 1941. It was through a joint rule of the Assembly and the State Senate to provide the legislature with its own analytical unit, essentially to serve as a counterweight to the governor's Department of Finance. And so even though you fast forward now 82 years later, and there are many different legislative staff entities out there, I think we continue to differentiate ourselves as fiscal and budget experts for the legislature.
There are 2 things you said, though, that I want to kind of highlight. One is you're nonpartisan. Even though it says Legislative Analyst Office, you're a nonpartisan office. The second thing I want to highlight is that you are often the counterweight to the Department of Finance. And as previous, I don't think you've told me this, but previous legislative analysts have said, well, we're more accurate on the budget than the Department of Finance. So there's always this back and forth between who has the most accurate assessment of the budget, but you got a pretty good record. Let me ask you this. The LAO, it sounds a lot like the Federal Congressional Budget Office. How are they different?
Yeah, both offices do provide nonpartisan analysis and assessments to our respective bosses, the Congress for the CBO and the legislature for us. Probably the biggest difference, though, between the 2 offices is that part of our statutory charge is to make fiscal and policy recommendations, whereas the CBO does not. It stops at the assessment stage. And, making recommendations can be challenging work, but it does wind up being some of our best action-oriented advice. And that's because our recommendations always flow from data and analysis, which I expect is especially valuable to our bosses in the legislature as they navigate the very partisan world in which we all live.
Yeah, the truth of the matter is, I do a lot of work as an arbitrator, as a judge, and judging matters. Of course, whenever I write a decision, the winning party thinks it's pure genius. Of course, the losing party has a different interpretation of that decision. So I'm sure some of your analysis, even though it's fact-based, it depends on who's getting the better side of those facts, I suppose. Let me ask you this. You're best known, the LAO is best known for their work on the budget. How would you describe your role in the state budget process?
Yeah, our budget work is really a key function of the office. It ranges from development of our fiscal outlook to the independent revenue estimates that we provide, to also careful review of all of the governor's proposals and contained in the governor's budget in January and also the May revision. And as we go through those proposals and identify any shortcomings, typically we'll offer fiscal and policy alternatives for the legislature to consider as they are deliberating their budget options. Also, I must mention that it may be lesser known, but even after the budget is adopted, we continue to work on safeguarding the legislature's prerogatives and intent by assisting it with carrying out various budget control mechanisms. So a good example here is if the state receives unanticipated federal funds after the budget has been adopted, we will review the administration's proposed allocation of those funds to ensure that they comport with, both the letter and the spirit of the legislature's previously articulated intent.
Yeah. And one of the things, you also make sure that the legislature, when they propose something, is it working, right? And you go back and you take a look at that. It's interesting. I just want to make a note. Your predecessor, one time I was interviewing him, Mac Taylor, great guy. And I quoted something out of a Sacramento Bee that was meant as a compliment. I don't know if he took it as a compliment. I said, they refer to you as the skunk at the annual budget party. It was meant as a compliment. I don't know if he took it that way. Anyway, so, do any particular pieces of legislation or budget issues come to mind when you think that are particularly good examples when your analysis has really had an impact?
I think so. Yeah, if I can, I'll take a recent example, which is that in the last few years, the state has become much more engaged directly engaged on issues around mental health, behavioral health, and homelessness, all of which have complex interactions and pose major, policy challenges for the state. Then this past spring, the governor put forward a set of proposals to reform how the state will deploy its Mental Health Services Act resources. This comes from a 2004 voter-approved tax. As we assessed this package for the legislature, we noted that the proposal was quite prescriptive in how these funds would be spent. And as a result, it would reduce county flexibility, and it would also introduce a new oversight mechanism. All of this in ways that we thought could differ from what the legislature's priorities were.
Yeah, that's an important function for you guys to have.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Yeah.
we're running up against the deadline here, so I apologize. But I wanted to give people an idea of what the LAO does. You do some terrific work, and I really encourage people to take a look at your website, lao.ca.gov, to see some of those reports. I want to thank Gabe Petek, who's the current LAO for California, for joining us. Up next, we're going to talk to the person who provides an independent assessment of financial and operational activities of state government, the state auditor. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report.
Welcome back. Established in 1962, California's Little Hoover Commission's mission is to, quote, investigate state government operations and, through reports, recommendations, and legislative proposals, promote efficiency, economy, and improve service, unquote. We're fortunate to have the chairperson of Little Hoover Commission, Pedro Nava, with us today. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Pleasure to be here.
So listen, first off, who makes up the commission? How are the commissioners selected?
Well, there are 13 commissioners, and we are appointed by the governor, by the Speaker of the Assembly, and by the pro tem from the Senate. And the commission is unique. It is the only permanent government watchdog of its type in the entire country. We're created by statute, and we are required to be composed of members of political parties in such a way that no one has any particular advantage. So, for example, I'm a Democrat, I'm the chair. The vice chair has to be a member of the opposite party.
So how does the commission's role differ from state and private sector bodies that analyze or review state programs?
Well, I think one of the advantages we have is that we are completely independent. We do have a budget that is authorized by the legislature, but with respect to the membership of the commission, the topics that we investigate and the work that we do, we are independent. We have the responsibility to evaluate the executive branch operations, so that includes the governor, and includes all of the state agencies as well.
You know, Little Hoover Commission analyzes, as you said, a wide variety of public policy issues. For example, you've looked into the issue of affordable housing. What did you find there?
Well, we found that it's a very complicated sort of process. A lot of the cost of housing has to do with the sorts of regulations that are created at the local level, boards of supervisors and city councils. In addition to that, the cost of construction is expensive in California, and there are a number of things that can be done to improve and make opportunity more available for people, and our report touches upon that, and we make some recommendations.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on another thing, and that is another report you did. You do a lot of reports, but a report you did on the study of regional economic development. What were your key findings there?
Well, the key findings for regional economic development is that the state of California has, up until recently, not done a very good job of making sure that resources are allocated appropriately between what we call coastal California and inland California. And so coastal California has done very well economically as compared to inland California, which has lagged far behind. But there have been some steps taken by the Newsom administration and some funding set up that is designed to address that disparity.
You know, another example of a study you're doing, and you don't shy away from the tough issues. You're now studying CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that you note has, quote, been the center of polarized debate and controversy, unquote. So what's the focus of this study?
Well, the work that we're doing with CEQA, I think, is going to go a long way towards actually illuminating facts and separating that from emotion. My opinion in looking at the issue is there's a whole lot of headline grabbing with respect to CEQA. My sense is that CEQA gets blamed for every delay and every impediment, whether it had anything to do with it or not. And so we've had 5 hearings, so we've been able to devote a substantial amount of time. We are in the process of preparing the draft report with recommendations that the full commission will examine very soon.
You know, it's interesting that, you know, CEQA does, you know, there are critics that say, hey, listen, it impacts housing construction, infill development, addressing climate change. I mean, there are some critics of CEQA on the other side, and maybe there is, some people say maybe there is a way you can modify that, but it seems to be the third rail when it comes to environmental politics. Let me ask this, we only got about 30 seconds left, but I'm going to ask you about commissions supporting legislation to help implement some of your report's recommendations. Can you provide any examples where that's happened, any proposed bills that have come into law?
Yeah, quite frankly, for the year of 2021 to 2022, we had 12 bills that were signed into law. So we had 16 issue briefs that we put out. We met 37 times, and a responsibility that we have as commissioners is when we make recommendations that are then adopted by members of the legislature, we are very actively pursuing support for those. We write letters, we attend hearings, and we act as advocates for the recommendations to be made into law.
Yeah, I know. Actually, I want to recommend our audience to kind of check out your reports at littlehoovercommission.gov. If you want more information, find it at littlehoovercommission.gov. It's actually lhc.ca.gov. I want to thank Pedro Nava, the chair of the California Little Hoover Commission, for being here. Moving on to California's watchdogs when we come back. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. You know, the press has been referred to as the fourth estate, alongside the 3 branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial. Given these hyper-partisan times, when people can increasingly choose to get their news from sources that reinforce their own preconceived biases, does the public still trust the traditional press to play the role of watchdog? Our guest is Laurel Rosenhall. She is the LA Times Sacramento bureau chief who oversees their coverage of the California Capitol, both in state government and state politics. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So listen, you know, what do you see as the role of the press in a democratic society? I mean, and also, can you give us some examples of where press reporting has actually changed public perceptions and therefore public policy?
Well, I think there's not one answer to what is the role of the press. I think our role is to inform and educate and entertain and create community, to speak truth to power, to hold officials accountable. I think our highest and best use is to bring out knowledge that wouldn't have been known if we weren't doing our job.
Yeah, so we've been talking to leaders of the state watchdog agencies like the LAO, Little Hoover Commission, about their role as government watchdogs. How much do you think their work influences policy?
I think they're very influential in the Capitol, particularly the LAO is highly respected as a source of nonpartisan information for lawmakers. But there is a back and forth in the process, obviously, as you know. And so, you know, how much influence they have is always subject to whatever other variables are in play that year with interest groups, with the governor, with how much legislators, you know, want to take that advice versus if they have another agenda of their own. So I don't see any like one particularly powerful angle, but they're obviously in the mix. Yeah, well, certainly the LAO when it comes to the finances, and the LAOs, they like to tell us that we're always closer to the final numbers than the Department of Finance, but be that as it may. You know, we invited the new state auditor, Grant Parks, to explain the work of their office, but his office declined. Frankly, it seemed a bit ironic given that their agency conducts investigations into improper government activities, that they were unwilling to share their work with the public. It should be noted that 2 past state auditors have regularly appeared on our program. Is
This is something you run into. What are your thoughts of when some public servants are reluctant to tell the public what they do and why they do it?
Well, I don't want to comment on the particular individual that you mentioned in your question because I don't know anything about that exchange. But I will say that generally speaking, I feel like social media and the ability for officials to communicate directly with people through their own channels, whether it's through social media or their websites or other platforms, have actually really complicated their relationships with the press. They don't, in their minds, need the press as much as they used to, because in their minds, they can go straight to the public without going through an intermediary. And in some cases, that has strengthened the communication and the bond that people feel with public officials. And that can be a good thing. But in a lot of ways, it reduces the accountability that they have because they don't have to face questions from reporters when they make big announcements. So I think that part of it is just the fallout from technological innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really good point there, but the accountability issue, because you can spin something in a way that, you know, it makes you look good or makes the situation look better than it really is. You need those critical questions that, of course, they're not going to ask themselves. Let me ask you one other quick question before we end the segment here, and that is private think tanks. We're going to get your thoughts on that. You know, some lean a little to the left, some lean a little to the right. There are some that really try to be nonpartisan. Are there any that you would recommend to someone who wants to get an unbiased analysis of state issues?
I have found the Public Policy Institute of California to be very reliable over the years. They have research on many issues. They've pulled on the same questions, surveyed on the same questions over many years. And they have experts who are really good at all kinds of important topics, whether it's demographics, crime trends, or other things. So I have found them very reliable.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. The PPIC is really excellent. I encourage people to kind of look them up when they're thinking about public policy issues. Very in-depth analysis and nonpartisan. Well, I want to thank our guest, LA Times Sacramento Bureau Chief Laurel Rosenhall. Up next, what about political columnists? What sources do they rely on? We'll talk to a longtime observer of California government and politics, Calmatters columnist Dan Walters, next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. You know, the public's worries over government secrecy are growing. Sometimes government officials actively attempt to shield records from the public. In other instances, government officials simply ignore requests for information. The bottom line, though, is that these actions can make it harder for constituents and journalists to hold government leaders to account. California has long prided itself on transparency, but even in California, some government agencies and politicians are more open than others. Is today's hyperpartisan attack mode of politics making government officials and politicians more guarded? And if, for whatever reason, the public is being stonewalled, where can they go to find accurate and reliable information about their government? Our guest is Dan Walters. He's a columnist for Calmatters and a longtime Capitol observer of state government and politics. Welcome back to the Maddy Report, Dan.
Thank you very much.
So it seems that increasingly politicians are reluctant to appear in anything but the most favorable media venues where a fawning interviewer asks only softball questions. Is it just me, or has this problem gotten worse over time?
Oh, it's gotten much worse over time. For a variety of reasons, certainly the internal upheavals of the media, the decline of newspapers particularly, the polarization in the larger society has manifested itself to a certain degree in polarized media, particularly the broadcast media. It's really a sad state of affairs, and I think it strikes even in California, as you mentioned, which prides itself supposedly on having a lot of sunshine on its government. But I've been around the Capitol for half a century almost, and I tell you, it has tightened down a lot for a variety of reasons. And I think the main one is once upon a time, back in the day, as the saying goes, you had three elements involved in debating issues in Sacramento. You had the Democrats, you had the Republicans, and you had the media. And two of those three have kind of gone down the tube. The Republicans have no power anymore. The media has, as I mentioned earlier, particularly the newspapers had just gone down. I can't say the toilet, but I mean really gone down. I was looking at some data the other day. At one time, for the Sacramento Bee had a circulation of 200,000. Now it's scarcely 10% of that.
Yeah.
The LA Times was well over 1 million, and they're now a few 100,000. I mean, so back in the day, the Republicans would point out something about through Democrats, and the media would follow up on that, and there would be some correcting. Same thing, Democrats saying something about the Republicans, the media would get in and say, "This is going here and going there," but there's not this interaction, there's not this sense of debate, and so everybody kind of tightens down and goes into the bunker and doesn't really want to engage anymore in public debate.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question about, it's not just politicians, it's government agencies as well. I mean, this program was intended to highlight some of the key state watchdog agencies, and much to my surprise, the new state auditor, Grant Parks, declined to participate. We had a similar experience last year when we wanted to talk to someone at the State Department of Health and Human Services to explain the governor's new care courts proposal. No one was willing to come on and talk about it. Is this something new, or has it always been so? And regardless, what, if anything, can or should be done about it?
Well, it is kind of something new. People used to feel an obligation to try to explain the public policies they were involved with. Now they don't feel that obligation because, again, there's nobody looking over their shoulder and saying, "Hey, you got to fess up. You've got to say what you want. You're doing." And so it has shut down a lot. Plus, there's been a centralization of media responses. Governors have increasingly centralized media responses within the governor's office, and the agencies are not as free as they once were to deal with media requests. The people who deal with those things in the agencies now are political appointees rather than career civil servants. I mean, all of these things manifest themselves in a kind of a shutting down of discourse over a lot of things. Yes, it is something it's not say exactly new, but it's certainly something that's evolved over time.
Yeah, and it seems like, with social media, and while we were talking with Laurel Rosenhall from the LA Times just a minute ago, and she was saying that, with social media, the politicians and bureaucrats can send out their own message and connect directly with the public. In some ways good, but in some ways bad, because then they're not open to any kind of criticism or critique. But we rely on you, Dan, to do that. So I encourage people to read your column. I always learn something when I read your column. So thanks for doing what you do, and thanks for being on the Maddy Report.
You're welcome.
All right. With that, if you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org and sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily. It covers all state politics that affect the Central Valley. I hope you do that. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.